Conan's Stygian fortress had a lot of potential. With a good concept and solid lore justification behind it, it could have been a revolutionary piece of content for PvE. However, its many faults led to sustained criticism and its eventual removal in the March 2025 update. Today we are going to ask one simple question: why did Al-Merayah fail? When the PvE siege was first announced in the Age of War reveal stream, people were reasonably excited. Players were fairly interested to see an event like this in PvE, and unlike dungeons or enemy camps, it was something that hadn't really been experienced thus far. The siege posed a very unique concept. It was essentially an inversion of the purge mechanics, where instead of defending your base, you would be besieging someone else. Again, this was a completely new form of content. The idea of a PvE siege promised a type of gameplay that I think a lot of people were really interested to experience, and through its modular destruction system it would also finally add a use for siege weapons in PvE. Up until that point there'd been very little reason to craft a trebuchet or use explosives outside of star metal farming, so people were quite interested in what could potentially be a new gameplay loop. I think some also assume that this could be sort of the equivalent of a raid dungeon. Many years ago I said I would like to see raid dungeons in Conan Exiles, and well, when I first saw the PvE siege I thought it could potentially be a lighter version of that, if that makes sense. Not just a dungeon where you tackle loads of trash mobs and then kill the boss, but a more strategic and involved experience where you'd have to plan out your resources, plan how you're going to attack, break into the enemy fortress and claim their riches. However, as everyone would later find out, the fortress wasn't exactly that. Also, quick shameless self-promo, consider checking out my content over on Patreon where you can get videos early or just join for free to see previews and progress logs for the upcoming Settlers Season 4. Plug over, let's continue. Upon its release, the fortress was disappointing, to be frank. The first initial complaint was about the aesthetics, which then when people actually got their hands on it and used it, complaints arose around design, rewards, balance, and especially performance. On that first point, to be fair, the fort did not look Stygian at all. From my understanding, this was a byproduct of the system the fort was built within, as it was also added for modders, and I'm pretty sure it's only allowed to use the base game pieces. To be fair, I think the devs kind of set themselves up a bit here. Stygian is probably one of the most easily identifiable cultures in the world of Conan, seeing as it is kind of analogous to ancient Egypt, so people do know what to expect when you say the words Stygian castle. If it hadn't been Stygian, I don't think there would have been many aesthetic complaints, but because it was, many people thought that this just did not represent the empire of Stygia at all, and though probably controversially I actually don't mind the visual design, I will agree, it's not very Stygian. Furthermore, though it looked huge, the fortress was not exactly as big as it seems. The optimal path through was very streamlined, but also with a lot of unnecessary fluff around the sides, which not only left the fort feeling smaller than it looked, but also hampered performance in an area that typically sees a lot of foot travel on most servers. The rewards from it were fairly lackluster, an okay supply of gold and scrolls, alongside explosives and a guaranteed legendary, but past that, nothing that special or even memorable. Additionally, there were issues with enemies keeping on spawning, which added to the perception of artificial difficulty and an unfun design. The complaints continued to grow about performance especially, pushing people away from the area surrounding the fort. Myself included, I deliberately avoided the savannah even at the best of times. That leads us to the March 2025 update. In the first patch of the unofficial Age of Fixes, the devs announced and then followed through with the removal of Al-Merayah, and frankly, I think it was probably justified. After the initial wave of people interested to try the content out, it seemed to kind of die off, leaving behind only complaints of performance, poor execution, and just a general dissatisfaction with how the siege played out. Furthermore, its removal does actually have a decent lore justification, but we'll touch on that in a moment. Al-Merayah became more of a source of complaints than it did actually decent gameplay experiences. Performance around the savannah was severely hampered, and aside from some methods to quickly level up thralls or grab an early source of explosives or the guaranteed legendary, people seemed to find the fortress lacking in both execution and rewards. The devs choosing to remove it and free up the savannah again was not only justified but probably a net positive. Would it have been better to add it as a server-side toggle for private servers? Possibly, but when something has failed to that degree, I can't blame them for cutting their losses and removing it. Furthermore, the sieges that were added to the Isle of Siptar had already done the same concept with better execution and better performance, and the removal of Al-Merayah also does fit in with the lore of the Stygian army being decimated by the Allied exiles, so its removal does fit cleanly into the story. Ultimately, I don't think many people were too upset to see the fortress at Al-Merayah be removed. Looking back at the legacy of the PvE siege, I think despite its failure, the concept was good and in the future should probably be revisited. Initial excitement to the idea of a destructible PvE fort was positive, as was the reception to the smaller and frankly better designed Siptar raids, and thus the problem really lay in Al-Merayah's execution. I've said before, and I've seen others echo the same sentiment, that Al-Merayah failed in the implementation, not necessarily the concept. The idea was good, but putting a hulking fortress in a busy part of the overland, alongside mostly forgettable rewards and an overall not so great gameplay experience was a big misstep. Had Al-Merayah been placed in an instanced off-map area to reduce performance issues and given a better gameplay experience and reward loop, it probably would have done fairly well. Even just removing the performance concerns from around the savannah would have taken a lot of heat off of the fortress, I think. The successes of the PvE raids on Siptar are a clear contrast to the failures on the exiled lands, and seeing as the modular system for this has already been developed, the devs may try to find a way to revisit it in the future and make something worthwhile again. Though most people would agree Al-Merayah was not exactly great, I think a lot of people would be interested to see a PvE siege actually done properly. To summarise, the fortress at Al-Merayah had a lot of potential, but failed mostly on implementation. Performance, a fairly mundane gameplay experience, and a forgettable loop rendered Al-Merayah as a source of derision and frustration rather than enjoyment. It failed entirely based on its execution. The concept was great, but it just wasn't engaging enough to demand players' attentions, and the performance issues actively drove people away from the area. By contrast, the PvE sieges on Siptar seem to have been generally well received and perform a lot better. I think it's also noteworthy that the sieges on Siptar seem to have a lot less wasted space than Al-Merayah had, which not only makes besieging them a bit more interesting as they often have loot tucked away in the side corridors, but also avoids the problem Al-Merayah had of all the extra fluff around the heart of the actual siege itself causing pretty hefty performance issues. Though the PvE siege on the exile lands failed, and its removal was justified, the concept itself is enticing, and if the devs handle executing this concept better in the future, and learn from what went right and what went wrong, it could lead to a PvE siege experience on the exiled lands that matches what people were actually hoping for. Al-Merayah had all the potential in the world with a wonderful concept, but unfortunately the execution was just not there, and that's why it's no longer in-game today. Anyway, that will about wrap us up. Al-Merayah has had a pretty tumultuous lifespan, but I think its removal was overall a net positive. Let me know what you thought about Al-Merayah and its removal in the comments below, and as always, don't forget to leave a like, always helps the channel out. Thanks for watching, and a massive thanks to our wonderful esteemed coffee cultists for continuing to support the channel over on Patreon. If you want to support the channel yourself, check out the Patreon through the link in the description, or join as a member here on YouTube by clicking join just below this video. Take care, and I'll see you soon.